On the show today, we have Trellance's very own Dan Price. He's here talking about fair lending. Does your credit union use fair lending practices? So we take a deep dive into this, so check it out. Hey everybody, Mike Lawson here with CUBroadcast. Welcome back to our show. And on today's program, we have Trellance's very own Dan Price is with us. Dan, how are you, sir? Good to see you.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Mike.
You are welcome. You're welcome. So today we are talking about does your credit union use fair lending practices? So essentially, fair lending practices out there. So it's a rising topic in our industry today, as you well know. So first question out of the gate here, Dan, is what is the risk of a credit union not conducting its own internal fair lending audit?
The risk of a fair lending internal audit or review. To understand, you probably have to know what is fair lending, and I think many credit unions know of fair lending, but the way that I like to think of it is where diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is tossed around a lot more frequently than fair lending, is kind of focused on internal procedures, how you're hiring, training opportunities, professional development, things like that. Fair lending is focused externally towards how are you treating your members across protected classes. So things like approval rates on loans, things like the interest rates that you're giving to members, and are you making credit available to all of the geographic areas within your SEG?
Yeah.
Those are kind of the main focuses of fair lending, which has always been a requirement of banks and credit unions. It's always something that people think about, but it has gotten, like you said, a lot of focus over the past year or so. Your question, which was what are the risks of fair lending or not complying with the fair lending rules, are that the reputational risks, I think, are probably the biggest risks here. What actually brings things like this into the spotlight, and fair lending was in the spotlight 10 or so years ago as well, are generally legal issues that come about as a result of fair lending violations. And recently, Navy Federal was named in a class action lawsuit related to their lending practices. Most of those were dismissed recently, but I said reputational first because the challenge is even being named in a class action lawsuit impacts a financial institution, right? Your members start to get the idea that you're not lending fairly, and just that being in the news is enough to impact loan volume. Yeah. So, legal and reputational risks, what furthers that, I suppose, is that as a result of those recently, NCUA has added fair lending to their supervisory priorities for 2024. So there are risks of examiners poking you and you not having a good answer to their exams. So that's of particular importance at credit unions. So a lot of risks. I think the largest one is that truly reputational risk where you don't even want to be named in something, but understanding and being able to support the things that you do through data is certainly a good step to mitigate against that risk.
Sure, yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up really quickly here, Dan, because we're hearing more and more about it with AI now, with the unfortunate bias that is baked into the data, unfortunately. And so we kind of weed that out. So we're hearing more of it with that as well, with the big AI trend that's going on right now. So I don't know what you guys are hearing from your side, but obviously in the media, there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I've definitely heard those stories, and that's the challenge, right? Is, even when explicit biases don't exist, there are implicit biases that can even be tracked through data that prove out they do exist. Yeah. Even if you don't feel like you're biased, you don't feel like the people that have those biases, they are provable using data and some of those anecdotes that you see in the news on AI-driven analytics like that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother show. But I just wanted to bring that up really quickly. So obviously fair lending is top of mind for everyone right now. So what would you say to a credit union who says, I don't need to worry about fair lending. I know we're doing things the right way. What would you say to a credit union who says that?
Yeah, so going back to the Navy Federal example, what happened leading into that class action lawsuit was, as virtually every credit union knows, every year you're required to submit your mortgage applications to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And that information, all of those applications, approvals, denials, that's all made to be public information.
Oh, wow.
And in 2022, an article was posted analyzing the top 50 mortgage originators, and it was found that Navy was approving something like 77% of mortgages to white borrowers, where they were only approving closer to 50% to Black and Latino borrowers. So that preceded the class action lawsuit. And we at Trellance, we have all of that data available to us as well. Anyone can download it. We've visualized it. And if you dive really deep into the data, most banks and credit unions are not that dissimilar from Navy in terms of their approval rates.
Yeah.
So, it's easy because they were named to say that they're one bad egg, but the reality is lots of folks fall into that similar scope of approvals versus denials. And there are plenty of explanatory factors for that. You don't know the underwriting criteria, the income levels, the credit scores of these borrowers that are coming through the door. But there's enough information to where if someone wants to paint a picture that's negative about your credit union,
for sure,
they likely could. And you want to be equipped for if that situation comes, not to mention, if an examiner comes knocking on your door, as they do every year or so. We talked about implicit versus explicit biases. Easy to say, hey, I don't treat anybody differently than anyone else. But implicit biases do exist. And at a credit union, you don't have control of, you personally don't have control of every loan that is reviewed and originated, approved or declined that goes out your door. Sometimes you can have third parties that have those relationships through, third-party mortgage originators or indirect auto lenders. As a credit union, you're responsible for those decisions the same way you are as if the underwriter sitting in the desk next to you makes that loan. So you want to have data available to you to support the way that you feel, even if it's correct.
Yeah, no doubt. And getting back to the Navy Federal story, I mean, there were so many holes in that story, and Navy Federal was a big fish in the so to speak. So there were, again, that's another show as well. But I'm glad you brought that up because there were many holes in that story. So all right, hey, let's get to the next question here. Disparate treatment and redlining are easier to recognize and react to than disparate impact. How can credit unions recognize and prevent disparate impact from impacting its members?
Yeah, as you're asking that question, I'm going to step back a minute and give an anecdote about, hey, we don't have any risk here. I've been looking at credit risk since 2010 or so. And a credit union in New York came to me and said, hey, the examiners have said we need to do a concentration risk analysis. But we don't have any risk in our portfolio. We make taxi cab medallion loans. They never default, right?
No.
Which was a fair point at the time, looking at historical information, but ultimately proved to be very true as that credit union was taken into conservatorship. We didn't have any work that we could do for them. They didn't want to do the work. But ultimately, those risks and impacts exist sometimes even when you don't think they're there.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. So, all right.
So, I did hear your question on disparate treatment versus disparate impact. And there are a few things that the rules focus on. One is disparate impact, which is, let me say disparate treatment, which is explicit bias towards members of protected classes. Disparate impact is harder to diagnose because what that is, it's when a borrower of a protected class is more likely or predisposed to take advantage of a product that comes along with a higher interest rate. For example, on an auto loan, a credit union might have things like credit score, obviously, in the risk-based pricing matrix. They might also model year of the vehicle, older vehicle years come along with a higher interest rate, or term of the loan come along with a higher interest rate. And if you find, or if it's found that borrowers of protected classes are more frequently financing older vehicles than unprotected, white male borrowers, then that could be considered a fair lending violation if, and it's a big if the criteria used in that pricing decision don't actually correlate with risk and with loss. So the easiest way to mitigate against the risk of a disparate impact type of violation is something that credit unions should be doing anyways, which is validate their risk-based pricing criteria and make sure that they're, as they increase the interest rate because of a certain criteria, that losses associated with that criteria are increasing as well, so that the risk premiums assigned make sense. And it's important in the context of fair lending and in disparate impact, but it's also very, very important in the context of lending, where if doesn't matter protected, unprotected, if you're charging a borrower more for a loan that doesn't actually come with higher risk, you're not doing right by your membership. So by looking at the risk-based pricing criteria and confirming they're valid, it not only kind of negates the risk that someone would say, you're giving me a higher rate for no reason, and that be a fair lending issue, but ensures that you're making the best product available to a broader scope of membership, providing more value to your membership through the right pricing on loan products, and also having more competitive loan products, which means more loans and growth at your credit union. So it's kind of a solution that solves for fair lending, but improves the credit union on a lot of different, facets there.
No doubt, no doubt. And to wrap up here, Dan, I mean, what are some final thoughts here on fair lending? I mean, again, it's a very top of mind topic right now, obviously for many reasons. But just to kind of wrap up here, any final thoughts on fair lending and where it is today?
So it's something that a lot of credit unions are assuming they're doing correctly. Kind of the question that you asked me earlier, and data always helps to mitigate against that risk. We've got the fair lending focus in the supervisory priorities, and we're already getting feedback from our credit unions that examiners are asking questions about fair lending that they've never asked before. So it's the right thing to do. It helps your credit union prepare for what's to come or potentially to come. Looking at this information, it helps you operate a better credit union. So there's ROA there in the term of either more loans, better pricing, and more yield. But at a minimum, it's something that getting out in front of can save you headaches in the future. So I find I've done risk analytics on the loan side and accounting-based allowance for loan loss analytics now for 15 years. I find sometimes it's the saving the headaches that causes people to act the most. And I think getting in front of it will alleviate a lot of potential issues, but at a minimum, save you that headache and get you some sleep in the future.
Completely. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Alrighty, sir. Well, I'm going to let you get back to work, Dan, because I know you got a lot on your plate and I don't want to keep you too long, but thank you so much for your insights today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.